I was 4 months from my CPA designation when my parents told me, over Sunday dinner, that they were done paying my tuition, until I apologized to my brother for something I never did. It was a Sunday in late October, the kind of evening in Mississauga where the leaves had already gone that wet orange-brown. That means winter's coming whether you're ready or not. My mother had made a roast with those little potatoes she always overcooked on purpose because my father liked them soft. My father sat at the head of the table the way he always did, cutting his food into small, careful pieces, taking his time, like he was rehearsing something in his head before he let it out of his mouth. My brother Tobias, 28, sat across from me with his jaw tight and his eyes glued to his plate. He hadn't looked at me properly in 19 days. Not since the thing at the lake house that had, somewhere between his version of events and my parents' willingness to believe it, become entirely my doing. 19 days earlier, Tobias had been let go from his position at the investment firm where he'd worked for almost 4 years. He told my parents it was because of something I'd said to his coworker Patrick at our cousin's cottage on Lake Simcoe over Labor Day weekend. Patrick had asked me, casually, over a beer, what Tobias was like to work with, and I'd said, honestly, not maliciously, that he could be a little difficult to give feedback to, that he didn't love being told he was wrong. That was it. That was the whole conversation. But somehow, in the retelling, that had become the reason my brother lost his job. In my parents' eyes, I had taken something precious from him and handed it to a stranger over a Coors Light. So that Sunday, when my father set down his fork and folded his hands in that particular way, I knew something was coming. I just had no idea how far it would go. He said it without raising his voice, which was somehow worse. He said that as long as I was living at home and they were covering my tuition for my accounting designation, I represented this family, and people who represented this family did not go around undermining their siblings to coworkers. He said Tobias deserved a real apology, not the stiff, mumbled one I'd given 2 weeks before. He said that if I couldn't manage that, they'd be pausing their contribution to my CPA program fees until I understood the seriousness of what I'd done. My mother didn't say a word. She just kept her eyes down on her plate and reached over to top up Tobias's water glass, and that small automatic gesture told me everything about where she stood, the way it always had. I sat there and felt something shift in my chest. Not rage, exactly. Something quieter. Something that felt like a door easing shut on its hinges. No slam, just a soft final click. I'd spent 26 years watching my parents orbit around my brother, like he was the only thing in the room worth looking at. Every hockey tournament where his games mattered more than my exams. Every Christmas where his preferences decided the menu, the seating, the whole shape of the day. Every disagreement where his story was simply accepted as the truth. End of discussion. I'd swallowed all of it for years because I loved my family, and because somewhere along the way I'd convinced myself that love meant constant accommodation. But that night, being told my education, 4 years of co-op placements, of writing CPA modules until midnight, of working a part-time job at a tax office just to cover my own books and software fees, would be held hostage until I knelt down in front of a man who had never once been held responsible for anything in his life. Something in me reached its limit and just stopped bending. I looked at my father. I looked at my brother, and I said one word, fine. Not fine, I'll say sorry. Not fine, you've made your point and I understand. Just fine flat, like the period at the end of a sentence that has gone on 4 years too long, maybe my whole life too long. My father nodded, satisfied, like he'd won an argument I hadn't actually agreed to. My mother let out a breath. My brother finally looked up, and for 1 second our eyes met, and I held his gaze just long enough to make sure he saw there was nothing left behind mine to negotiate with. Then I pushed my chair back, folded my napkin on the table the way my mother had taught me when I was 7, and walked upstairs. I didn't sleep that night. By 10, I'd pulled my 2 duffel bags down from the top of my closet. By midnight, they were full. Clothes, my passport and SIN card, my CPA prep binders, the small lockbox where I kept my savings bonds and my grandmother's amethyst ring, the one thing of hers nobody else in the family had ever wanted. I packed quietly, methodically, the way you do something you've half-rehearsed in your mind for longer than you'd admit. My friend Priya had a basement apartment in Etobicoke and had been telling me for the better part of a year that the pull-out couch was mine whenever I needed it. I texted her at 12:51 a.m. She wrote back in under 3 minutes. Door codes 4471. Come whenever. I'll leave the porch light on. By 4 in the morning, my car was loaded and I was sitting in the driveway in the cold dark, looking at the house I'd grown up in, the porch light my mother always left burning. The basketball net my brother had begged for at 14 and used maybe a dozen times before it became something the snowplow guy had to dodge every winter. The hydrangea bushes my grandmother had planted along the front walk before she passed, the ones I'd watered every single summer since I was 9 because nobody else remembered to. I expected to feel something break. I didn't. I felt strangely, almost frighteningly clear, the way the air feels right after a thunderstorm has finally moved through. I drove to Priya's. I slept maybe 3 hours on her pullout. I woke up, made instant coffee because that was all she had, and started looking up emergency funding options for the last stretch of my CPA program. Bursaries, the provincial student aid portal, anything. There were more options than I'd expected. I also still had my part-time job doing seasonal tax prep at a small accounting office in Mississauga, the one my parents had always rolled their eyes at. "You don't need to work, we take care of you," which turned out to be the thing that kept me financially afloat that whole month. My phone started buzzing around 8 that morning, my mother first, then my father. I let both calls go to voicemail and kept typing on my laptop. What I hadn't planned for, hadn't rehearsed for in any version of this morning I'd run through on the drive to Priya's, was the message that came in from Tobias at 8:37 a.m. 4 words. "Tell me you didn't." No context. Nothing about what he thought I'd done, or sent, or said to anyone. Just that raw, unguarded panic compressed into a text from a man who, 19 days earlier, had acted like he held every single card at that dinner table. I stared at the screen for a long minute. Then my phone rang again, and this time it was my father, and when I finally picked up, his voice didn't have the calm, measured authority it always carried at the head of the table. He sounded like someone who'd walked into a familiar room and found all the furniture gone. "Vanessa," he started, then stopped himself, like the name in his own mouth felt wrong. "What did you send him? What's going on?" And that was the moment I understood that whatever Tobias was so afraid I'd done, I hadn't done it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I want to be clear about something here, because I keep thinking back on it. I hadn't sent anything. I hadn't called Patrick, hadn't messaged anyone at the firm, hadn't said one word to a single soul about my brother. Since that conversation at the lake house, I had packed 2 bags and left a house in the dark. That was the entirety of my crime. Whatever my brother believed I had done, whatever had drained the color out of his face enough to send that panicked text before 9 in the morning, was something living entirely inside his own guilt. And it turned out that guilt was carrying a lot more weight than any of us in that family had ever been told. When my father asked me what I'd sent, I told him the truth. I said I hadn't sent anything to anyone. I said I'd packed my room, loaded my car, and left while everyone was asleep. I said I was safe, I was at a friend's place, and I'd be in touch when I was ready and not before. He went quiet on the line for a long stretch. Not a peaceful quiet, the kind that sits right before something cracks open, and then he said he needed to call me back. He hung up before I could say anything else. I sat at Priya's little kitchen table, coffee going cold in front of me, phone face up on the laminate, and I waited. Priya didn't ask a single question. She just put a plate of toast in front of me, sat down across the table with a paperback, and let the silence be normal, like it was any other Tuesday morning, and I loved her for that more than I knew how to say out loud. The callback came almost 40 minutes later. It wasn't my father. It was my mother, and she was crying. Not the careful, managed tears she used when she wanted to steer a conversation somewhere, but real crying, the unguarded kind that almost scared me to hear. She told me that after my father had gotten off the phone with me, he'd gone upstairs to tell Tobias I hadn't sent anything. And Tobias hadn't looked relieved. He'd looked worse. Because for the first time in longer than any of us could remember, my father had looked his son in the eye and asked him a question he'd apparently been too afraid to ask for 19 days straight. And Tobias, alone in a room with a father who was no longer nodding along and smoothing things over for him, couldn't hold the story together anymore. What came out, in pieces, the halting way things come out when someone's been holding them down through sheer force of performance, was this. Tobias hadn't lost his job because of anything I'd said to Patrick at the lake house. He'd been let go because of a formal complaint filed against him by 2 junior analysts on his team, who reported that he'd taken credit for their modeling work on at least 3 client files, and that he'd spoken to them in ways HR considered to constitute a hostile work environment. There was a documented file. There were emails. There was a meeting with HR that he'd never told a single person about. And rather than face that at home, Tobias had built an entire alternate version of events where I was the villain, where one offhand sentence to Patrick over a beer had derailed a career he'd actually derailed himself. He'd fed that story to my parents, and my parents, who had spent close to 3 decades finding it easier to believe whatever version of reality my brother handed them, had accepted it without question. They'd used it to threaten my education, to sit at that table with the full weight of parental authority, behind a lie they hadn't even bothered to check. My mother told me all of this, with her voice breaking apart every few sentences. She said she hadn't known. I believed her, mostly, and I also understood that not knowing had taken a fair amount of practiced effort on her part over the years. She said my father was downstairs and wasn't speaking to anyone. She said Tobias had gone up to his room and shut the door, and that the whole house felt different, like the air pressure had changed. I didn't have much to offer her in that moment, because I genuinely wasn't sure what comfort I could give, honestly. What I told her instead was that I needed time. I said I wasn't ready to come home, and that I wasn't even sure home was still the right word for that house anymore. I said that what had happened at that table wasn't a misunderstanding or an accident. My education had been used as leverage. My future had been made conditional on my silence and my willingness to apologize for something I hadn't done. And even if Tobias had been telling the truth about all of it, even if I really had said something that cost him his job, using my tuition as a weapon would still have been wrong. Now that it was clear he hadn't told the truth about any of it, I needed space to figure out what kind of relationship, if any, I still wanted with people who had been so quick to believe the worst version of me. My mother said she understood. I think, in that moment, she actually meant it. The weeks after that were hard in the ordinary, unglamorous way real life is hard. I applied for emergency funding through my school and got a partial grant that covered most of what was left on my CPA fees. My tax office picked up my hours for the fall season, which helped more than I expected. Priya wouldn't take a cent of rent from me and told me to pay her back one day by treating her to dinner once I was a CPA making real money. I studied harder that stretch than I ever had in my life, because I had something to prove, not to my parents, not to Tobias, but to the version of myself who had almost let one dinner table conversation become the end of everything I'd worked for. My father called me 2 weeks later, not to explain, not to defend what had happened. Just to say he'd been wrong, that he'd let his picture of Tobias crowd out what was fair to me for far longer than he wanted to admit, and that he was sorry. It was the most direct apology I'd ever gotten from him in my whole life. It didn't fix everything between us. It wasn't supposed to. But it was real, and I held on to it. About a month after that, I heard through my mother that Tobias's old firm had quietly let the story get around. Not maliciously. Just the way these things travel in a small industry, and 2 of the firms he'd interviewed with afterward had passed on him once they made a call to his old manager. He's working now, somewhere smaller, somewhere with less prestige attached to the name on the building. I don't take any particular joy in that. I also don't pretend I don't notice it. Tobias and I haven't spoken since that fall. That might change one day. It might not. I've stopped trying to decide in advance what forgiveness is supposed to look like, or what calendar it has to run on. What I do know is that I finished my CPA designation in the spring, on schedule, sitting my final exam in a community college gymnasium in Etobicoke with a pencil case Priya had bought me as a joke that said future CPA current disaster on the side. I have my own 1-bedroom apartment now north of the Eglinton line, nothing fancy but mine, with my name alone on the lease. I wake up most mornings without that low hum of dread I used to carry around without even noticing it was there. And the lockbox I carried out of that house in the dark, the one with my grandmother's amethyst ring inside, sits on my dresser every single day, and reminds me that I knew exactly who I was, even at 4 a.m. in a cold driveway with nobody watching. That's the part nobody gets to hold over me. Not ever again.